Hi there, welcome to this build of a 40-inch wingspan Clancy Aviation Speedy Bee. And as you can see from all this in front of me, we're almost finished now. We've got everything covered. In the last video we did the wings and the fuselage, and since then I've actually done the control surfaces as well. Now in this video we're going to put it all together and get it ready for the airfield. Now the first thing we're going to have a look at is doing the windscreen, which is a really simple affair, I hope, and then we'll have a look at the control surfaces before we actually start fitting out all of the electronics and components and the control linkages. So what I'm going to do now is I'll clear the deck, move the camera around, and we'll have a closer look at the windscreen. Right, well, as I said, it's a very simple affair, the windshield, and we've got a pattern for that, a windshield pattern that comes with the plans that we downloaded from AutoZone. And as I said, it's very simple shape, and it even gives us the best locations, or the suggested locations, for the holes to attach it to the nacelle. And we've got here, it says 0.01 acetate, 0.01 of an inch, or that's around about 250 microns. So I bought myself a pack of acetate sheets, A4 acetate sheets, and I've just put it on top of the plan, drew the shape with a marker pen, cut it out, and then I wiped off the marker pen with a bit of alcohol. And now we've got, just get that the right way round, a simple windshield that will just bend around like that, and that's basically all we're going to fit. And to fit that, I'm going to be using some screws like these. Let me just get one out and show you. These are what I used to use for servos. They're like a crosshead screw, which normally I don't like crosshead screws, but they're crosshead screws with like an integral washer. I don't know whether that actually shows up, but I quite like these for fixing windscreens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill the holes as suggested on the plan. I'm then going to attach it with the screws, and then I'm going to take the screws out, and I'm going to go to the underside of the wing, and where the screws come through the balsa, I'm just going to CA a little bit of plywood just on the inside, and that will give the screws something to bite into, because otherwise they've only got just, I can't remember what the thickness of the balsa is, but they've only got a fairly thin bit of balsa, which they'll probably pull out of with time. So I'm going to get on and do that, and then we'll move on to the ailerons. Right, I've now got the windscreen fitted, and that pattern has fit really nice onto that nacelle. Didn't need to adjust it at all. And you see the screws with the integral washers, and as I said earlier, I've put little bits of plywood on the inside of there. I think it's 2mm plywood, just for the screws to hold into. And if I hadn't done that, it would have caused problems. They would have pulled out almost certainly, because the balsa's very thin. Now you can see here, while I was doing that, I added a button for fueling, so I can just pull that out, pipe will come up, there is a space here in the nacelle inside where that can just coil a little bit, and that'll just push in. And I quite like that because it's a nice clean solution. You haven't got to disconnect from the engine, you haven't got a spare bit of hose with a clamp on it. You've just got a button that looks a little bit kind of harking back to the days of radiator caps on old engines. So it's a little bit, like I say, a little bit kind of retro perhaps. I had to, can we see that on the inside? You can just see the cap there. It's just got a little round nut on it, and I used a pair of long nose pliers just to tighten that up, and that's gone quite tight. And I could put a dab of super glue or a dab of epoxy on the thread, but I think it's going to be secure enough, and if I do glue it, then I'll probably never get it out. So far better to have it like that. Right, now onto the ailerons. Right, so it's time to fit these massive ailerons, and as I said in a few videos ago, I'm using these Cavan pin hinges, and they're quite nice, good sized hinges. 3 of those. I've epoxied them into the ailerons already, and I just smeared epoxy on, pushed them in. Now the trick with this is being careful not to get glue into the hinge. I put a very small amount of synthetic oil on the actual hinge itself with a paintbrush, and then I smeared the epoxy on and slid the hinges in, but not all the way because it'll push the glue out. I pushed them almost fully in, and then I wiped off the glue. I used a stirrer to scrape off the glue, because we want to make sure that we don't get that epoxy in the hinge. So I'm going to do a similar thing with this now. I'm going to just check there's a little bit of oil on the hinge. I'm going to smear epoxy onto the main portion of the hinge, and then I'm going to slide them in. I've made sure these slots will accept the hinges, and I will put them into, like I say, about 3/4 of the way, just like that, and then wipe off any excess. It's going to be really fiddly, but it'll be good to get it done. Now I'm going to watch this while the epoxy sets and make sure that these hinges don't stiffen up because they've got glue in them. And if they do stiffen up, I've had that happen in the past with both CA and epoxy hinges on the odd occasion, and if you keep working it, then it'll be fine, but hopefully we won't need to do that. So I'm going to get the epoxy on these and get them in, and to be honest, I'll be pleased and relieved when I've got these hinged. Right, I've now got these hinges glued in place, and I'm just waiting for the epoxy to cure. I've got some epoxy over there which I can test just to see when it's starting to go. Now I used a stirring stick, as I said, just to scrape off any of that excess epoxy before I pushed the hinges fully home. And then once they were fully home, I extended the ailerons to their fullest amount and used a little bit of 95% ethanol and a tiny little bit of cloth just to wipe those hinges and make sure that the actual hinge joints were nice and clear of epoxy. I don't want to put too much alcohol on because I don't want it to soak into the joints and weaken the actual glue. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to keep moving these every 30 seconds or something like that, and just make sure that they don't start to stiffen up because I've got glue in them. I don't think I have, and I think it's going to be fine, but better to know it's happening and to then work these, and if you do, it won't seize solid, because once it sees solid you've got a problem. But I obviously don't want to move these too much that I actually move the hinges. So I'm going to wait for this to go off now, and then we'll think about getting the surfaces done on the fuselage. Right, well, the epoxy's cured and these have gone on really nicely. They're nice and free, you can see they're dropping under their own weight. They're very slightly stiffer than they should be, marginally. So there's just a little bit of epoxy got into 1 or 2 of the hinges, but they are still pretty free, like I say, dropping under their own weight, and that will free up even more once they're used. So the next job on this wing really is to fit the servos, get the tank fitted and the switch, and then I think, get the engine sorted on the front, and then we're more or less there. And I'm going to do that fairly soon, but the job I'm going to do first is to fit the tailplane to the fuselage. Now the tailplane we covered but left a bare section in the middle there, top and bottom, and that now slots into the slot on the back of the fuselage. And when we constructed the fuselage, I made sure I sanded this slot to make sure that that tailplane was horizontal and to the fuselage, and more importantly parallel to the wings. So we want both the wing and the tailplane horizontal, but we want them parallel to each other. That is more important than where they are in relation to the fuselage, to have them parallel. Last thing we want is is sort of one at a different angle to the other. But hopefully we've got that right when we built it, and I will check it just to make sure, and we can make adjustments if necessary, but I don't think we need to. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure the tailplane is in the correct place. I'm going to measure side to side. I'm going to measure from the tip to the front tip there to the tip here. And just to make sure that's square, because the last thing we want is it exaggerated but crooked like that. Once I know that's in place, in the right position, I'm just going to draw down on the tailplane with a pencil lightly where it meets the fuselage, and then I'm going to cut back the covering so that the covering just disappears into the fuselage, so we actually get some balsa on balsa, and then we can CA this tailplane into place and it'll be nice and secure. Once I've done that, I'm going to be CAing the hinges for the elevator, which is a really simple job. We just line it all up and wick the CA in. And I'm then going to be putting on the tailplane, the fin rudder kind of assembly. It's kind of a dual purpose, isn't it? And I'm using these Cavanagh hinges, the same as on the ailerons, and I will probably glue them into the tailplane first, and then once that's cured, nice and free, I'll glue the whole assembly into the fuselage. So it'll be a kind of a two-step process. I just find it neater that way and easier to make sure I don't get glue in the hinges. I've really been cracking on with this now, and I think it's fair to say that the fuselage is finished, except for the placement of the receiver and the battery. Particularly the battery is the important one, because we want to put it in the correct location to get this CG as specified on the plans. So I'm going to wait until I've got the wings and the engine and everything to see where we need to put that to reach the desired CG, if it's going to fly decently. Now we've got all of the elevator, the fin, rudder coupled up. See, I've got the tail wheel on there, which is quite nice to get done, and we've got the suspension. Now I'll just plug in my servo tester, and we can see that working quite nicely. My servo tester's not brilliant, but it is working, and we can see the tail wheel moving there nicely. And we've got just unplug this, got the suspension all done, and it feels really good to get the suspension done as well as the tail wheel, but just to see how well that looks and how nice it works. I think it really adds something to the Bees to have shock absorbers. Whether it needs it is irrelevant, it just kind of makes it look good. So anyway, oh, and I'll just show you the servos inside there. See, there's nothing else in there, bags of space for the battery. If you're watching this video and you haven't seen the other videos, all of the setting up of the suspension, the servos, the elevator and rudder, it was all done previously in another video. Now we're just pulling what we've done before together to get it ready for the airfield. So if you're interested to see the makeup of the suspension, how that was done, then go back, have a look in the playlist, and you'll find the video for that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get on and do the wings and the engine. I'm pointing up here because it's hanging up on the wall, and get that all finished. There's very little to do now before this is finished. Right, well, I've now got this bird pulled together, and I am really pleased with how it's turned out. I've got the fuel tank in, I've got all of the electronics set up, I've done all of the throws, I've set the throws. If I just turn this on and we can see that, we've got the ailerons. I've got 1/2 inch up and down on the ailerons for a start. I've also got dual rates, so if there's a problem I can switch over. I've got 3/4 of an inch up and down on the elevator and 3/4 of an inch either way on the, let's just lift the back up, on the tail wheel there, look. The tail wheel clicks a little bit. I'm not quite sure why, I need to have a look at that. But we've got the pipe on, and that runs lovely, and these little clips that we made have worked out really nice with those black elastic bands, and I'm really pleased how that's worked out. And I think with this 4-stroke on the front, this should run beautifully. And we've even got ourselves a pilot. To be honest, the pilot was a little bit heavy, so, but hey ho. I've balanced it, and it's coming out pretty good. I think it's very slightly nose heavy, but much rather have it nose heavy or slightly nose heavy than slightly tail heavy. We'll see how it flies, and we can always adjust it. And with an IC model, you always do the CG with the fuel tank empty. So when the fuel tank's full and you take off, you have a slightly nose heavy plane which will fly fine, and when you land it with an empty tank, or if it's an empty tank, then you're coming in with a perfect CG for landing. That is much better than checking the CG with a full tank, taking off with a perfect CG, and then coming into land 10 minutes, 5 minutes later with an empty tank and a tail heavy plane that's not going to respond particularly nicely perhaps. So anyway, we've got this finished now, and we've got the suspension on the front all working really nicely, and I don't know whether we just saw that a minute ago. One thing I should say, and I guess it's a little bit of a confession, when I put this all together and had a look at where the CG was, this was coming in a little bit tail heavy, and I wasn't happy with the idea of adding weight to the nose, because I'd have had to have added quite a bit of weight to the nose possibly. So I decided to move the servos. I know we'd set them all up and got them just right, but it wasn't a big deal. It probably took me about an hour or two, and I just moved them much further forward and extended the control rod, so we can have a look at that now. Right, we can see we've got the servos here now on the CG, and they were quite a way back as shown on the plans, and actually I thought that from mocking it up was going to be a good location, but obviously things have changed. I've lengthened the control rods with this 4mm carbon fibre, and I've just joined that to the steel by drilling a hole in the side of the carbon fibre and bending a little 90-degree bend on the end of the steel and poking that into the carbon fibre, wrapping it in thread, and then epoxying it just the way you would if you were doing that with a wooden control rod. I've got the receiver in the front here, mounted on some foam to protect it from insulate it from the vibration, and I've got the battery shoved up right in the nose here. I don't know what changed with this, but it came out heavier on the tail than I thought it would do from mocking it up. But that's one of the beauty of working with balsa and being a modeller. We can change it, we can do what we need to do to make things right, and far better to move these forward like I did than to stick a chunk of lead in the nose to make it balance out. Well, I can't wait now to get this out to the airfield and see how it flies. I mean, I'm going to pick a really nice day. There's no point in spending all this time and effort in building this and then going on a kind of a dodgy day. You want to make sure that everything is on your side. and I'll be taxiing it up and down, making sure the engine runs right, making sure it turns okay, and then when it's right we'll try that maiden flight, and that'll be really exciting. I can't wait to see this in the air. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video series of building this Speedy Bee, because I've really enjoyed building it. There was a lot more involved than I anticipated when I set out on this build, but it's been really interesting and quite different to some of the builds I've done in the past. So anyway, I hope you found it useful, I hope you found it interesting, and please come back and see how we get on in that maiden flight.